the best recommendation letter I read when I worked at Dartmouth. And I read probably 10,000 recommendation letters from principals, from politicians, from guidance counselors, from teachers. And the one that stood out the most was from a high school custodian. And that high school custodian wrote to us and said, the reason you should admit John Doe is because John is the only kid who ever bothered to learn my last name. Point of that was whether that kid got into Dartmouth or not, whether that kid went to Harvard, whether that kid went to community college, whether that kid lived in his parents' basement for the next 20 years. That's a kid who bothered to learn the name of a custodian.
Hey friends, welcome to the Paula Ferris Show. I'm your host, Paula, and my daughter, Caroline, is going to join me in conversation today, along with the former admissions director of Dartmouth. You probably know we're doing a month-long series on college, really putting my journalist hat on, trying to look at it from all the different angles. And I'm doing this because so many of you had so many questions, and we're answering your questions along the way. So week one was with Ron Lieber. He's the New York Times money columnist and really making a case for and against college. Last week, we talked to Chip Layton of The Layton Show, funny guy, but he said it wasn't so funny when he dropped his son off at college last year. It was a gut punch, super emotional. And I know so many of you are dropping your kids off at college, or maybe you did over the weekend. And I'm just sending you a big hug. A friend of mine texted and said, I don't like this era. And it is the letting go era. And it's something that I know I'm dreading, but if I could encourage you, and I've heard from so many parents who do have older kids that we don't just have 18 years, so don't buy that lie. It's just a different type of relationship, and it's a different chapter in our relationship with our kids. But today, my daughter Caroline, she's a junior in high school, is joining me alongside Becky Sabky, who's the former admissions director at Dartmouth College. Becky also wrote a great book called Valedictorians at the Gate. If you feel the admissions process has gone mad, that's because Becky says it has gone completely bananas. She's going to tell us a story about the best letter of recommendation she ever received, why it brought her to tears, and the surprising person who wrote it. But she's also going to make a case for the gap year, which is really fascinating to me. So many of you had questions about the gap year. We will get to all of your questions. I know Cheryl and Corinne and Brooke and Michael and Krista and Katie had tons of questions. She has some great advice for kids and parents. We've struggled because we don't even know where to start. So how do we find the right schools? And notice I said schools, not school. How do we find the right schools for our kids? And Becky has fabulous advice for parents, but essentially we need to take a step back. We need to chill out a little bit, which is hard for me. I'm kind of hands-on, and my kids will tell you I'm a bit much. And after the conversation, you're going to hear my key takeaway, my pinpoint, if you will. But without further ado, here's my daughter Caroline and Becky Sabky talking about the admissions process and how it's gone mad, answering your questions, and making a case for a gap year. Okay, so Becky Sabky, it's so great to be in your presence. It's so great to have you on the podcast, along with my wonderful daughter, my only daughter, Caroline.
I am thrilled to be here. And this is my first time speaking to a mother-daughter duo on a podcast. So I'm psyched.
Amazing.
Wow.
That's pretty cool, Caroline.
That is pretty cool. Gotta
Caroline,
make sure it's good.
Yeah, we got to make sure it's good. We have to bring our A game, Caroline.
We do.
No pressure.
No pressure.
No pressure
at all. So, Becky, as we are doing this series on college, and the pros and cons, where do we even start? I'm just to tell you a little bit about my background. I am a mother of 3. I have told my kids, I don't really care if you go to college or not. I do want you to, get a good job and focus on, a career outside. But I've told my kids, if you want to go to college, we'll support that. If you don't, we'll support that too. And Caroline jokes that one of her brothers will be living in her basement till they're 50 years old. I know there are other options and alternatives out there, trade schools, apprenticeships. So as we begin this conversation, Caroline is a rising junior. I want you to pretend like you know nothing about our situation. Where do we even begin this process? Because I know it's super stressful for the students. It's super stressful for the parents because I don't know where to start. I did go to college. My husband went to college. My mom didn't go to college. Her mom dropped out of high school. So it's not a legacy. College is not a legacy in our family. So where do we even start having this conversation?
Yeah, that's the number one question I get, right? Where do we start?
Yeah.
And I think for me, when I talk to families, because it is a family process, it's not just the student, it is the parents, it is the siblings, it affects everyone. And I will say one of the things I don't speak about is financial aid, but I also feel like, when we talk about college admissions, financial aid is another huge conversation in this piece, whether you have all the money in the world or you have nothing. And again, that's a family conversation. So I tell families, not just students, not just parents, I tell families the best place to start is to think about high school for the sake of high school and not as a means of getting into a college. Because I think that if you think about high school and the enrichment process, high school as a stepping stone to what's next, it really kind of flips the conversation on its head, and it allows students to take back a little bit of control of this process. Because I think so many families think, oh my gosh, what do we have to do to get into college? And rather, I say to families, before you start this, think about, how do I make the most of high school for the sake of high school so I can be prepared for what's ever next? And I think as long as you kind of approach all of these other questions from there, how do I make my list? What do I write my essay about? What's on my resume list? If you start with, how do I make the most of high school? How are things going in high school? If you make the most of high school, your college application is going to be fine. And so kind of having that conversation about high school for the sake of high school, a family conversation about kids, we care about high school, not just where you're going to get in. And that starts a healthy conversation as you move forward.
Caroline, what do you think about that? Because, we're going through this now. We have a rising ninth grader. And he's already we chose almost all of his classes for his entire high school curriculum. And they're like, what do you want to go into? How the heck does he know? He doesn't even know what time he's going to get up tomorrow morning. And Caroline, for you had to do the same thing. You're choosing your high school curriculum based upon what you think you're going to do when you grow up. And it just like the questions they're starting to ask so early, the process seems so jacked up. So how can Caroline, I'd love your take on what she just said. How are they supposed to focus on high school and make sure that experience is what it should be when the pressure starts in middle school to determine their entire curriculum so that they can figure out what they want to do after high school?
Yeah. So with everything you were saying, I definitely agree that people do need to focus more on living their life in the present, because obviously you're only a teenager once, you're only in high school once. And I think finding the right balance of making sure you're prioritizing your classes and trying to get good grades, but also not only focusing on what you're doing so you can get to the next step. You need to focus on what's right in front of you.
But is that the message you're getting, Caroline, from high school administrators and counselors and teachers? Is that the message that you've been getting throughout your adolescence and now teenage years?
I would say that the message that high school is really just a stepping stone to college is something I've been taught often, not by every teacher I've ever had, but a lot of them have done so. For example, a lot of my English teachers have taught me a lot about writing college essays, how to take notes in college, things like that. And a lot of times teachers will try and prepare us for college more by giving us harder tests, harder classes. And I guess that's what AP classes are for, just to prepare you for college, really.
And hearing that, and then hearing you, Becky, how are we supposed to reconcile that when high school is just a stepping stone? That's kind of the message that they're getting.
Yeah. I would say college is just a stepping stone for whatever's after that, right? You can turn, there's stepping stones all the way. I worked at Dartmouth for many, many years, and I would see families that put so much pressure on their kids to get into school X, whether it was Dartmouth, whether it was an Ivy, whether it was their, legacy, whether it was wherever it was. And when students didn't get in, right? Because at a lot of these schools, the admit rates are 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%. And I'm not just talking about Ivies here, but I would see kids who felt like they failed. They failed their parents. They failed their families. They failed at high school because they didn't get in, right? And that is such a dangerous message. And so, when I hear Caroline, I think you're right? You take AP classes, you take all of these, difficult classes to prepare you for what's next. As long as the conversation is what's next and not prepare you for Dartmouth, right? Because then if you don't get into Dartmouth, you feel like that, it was for what? And I think as the conversation is for what's next, I think it's great to challenge yourself as much as possible. That's the point of high school. Just one quick side note here. When I left college admissions, I had a baby and I wrote this op-ed, and I feel like maybe it was the maternal hormones in me, Paula, going through me, because I had now become a mother.
Familiar.
I have to kind of talk, walk the walk, because I was talking the talk about becoming a parent and, not putting too much pressure on our kids and how to take classes for taking classes. Anyway, I wrote this op-ed and it got picked up by the New York Times, and it was about the best recommendation letter I read when I worked at Dartmouth. And I read probably 10,000 recommendation letters from principals, from politicians, from guidance counselors, from teachers. And the one that stood out the most was from a high school custodian. And that high school custodian wrote to us and said, the reason you should admit John Doe is because John is the only kid who ever bothered to learn my last name. And it was such, as an admissions committee in an Ivy League school, it was
I'm
such
literally
this
gonna
moment.
cry.
Yes. And again, like Paula and Caroline, like the point of that was whether that kid got into Dartmouth or not, whether that kid went to Harvard, whether that kid went to community college, whether that kid lived in his parents' basement for the next 20 years. That's a kid who bothered to learn the name of a custodian, made an impression on that community. I have goosebumps still talking about it. And that's where, when I talk to families right now, that's the little anecdote I use, because we got so many letters from famous people, from politicians, from presidents. And the one that struck us all the most was just something out of the ordinary that we didn't see. And it kind of had this aha moment of, for Caroline, who clearly is a bright, wonderful woman, it's about kind of, having a holistic learning experience in high school for the sake of high school. And so I just tell that little story because I do think high school matters to prepare you for the next chapter, whatever that is.
Caroline, what do you think about that story? That I'm tearing up. Just,
Mom, you tear up at every story.
Yes.
Yeah, that's called, thank you. That's perimenopause for you.
Yeah.
I get real emotional. See, it's these confusing messages we want our kids to achieve, but then we're raising kids who can perform but can't perceive, and who can earn but can't empathize, right? And exactly. I feel like, and you can speak to this too, like the process is kind of jacked up, right? We're placing so much emphasis on the accomplishment and what are you going to do? And yet it was that moment for you where it was a moment of humanity, a moment where this man was dignified when no one else would dignify him. Why aren't we rewarding that more? And what do we do about these mixed messages that we're telling our children?
Well, and I think, one of the messages is admissions is a business. And, I hear people say it's an art, it's a science, and I say it's a business because when I speak, and I don't represent Dartmouth anymore just for my, legal cover, but, Caroline, right? Like you have classmates that are going to be applying to so many schools, and your classmates, some of these decisions will not make sense to you, right? You'll sit there and go, why didn't this kid get into X? Why did that kid get into Y? And all of these questions, it's because admissions is a business. And frankly, it's a paper process. And you are going to fill out an application that doesn't necessarily represent, holistically who you are. And they'll say it's a holistic application process, but it's a paper process. They're doing the best they can with what they have on paper. And so it is a business, and they need to create a class, and they have, institutional priorities. And so I think for a kid like you, Caroline, and I'm going to ask you a question. I mean, I'm curious from where you sit, how your peers are feeling about this process. I mean, are they feeling the stress? Are they feeling like it will be okay? Are they feeling overwhelmed? Do they feel like there's not enough time? Like, what's the consensus among your peers?
Obviously, going into junior year, that's when things start getting more serious, college visits, you got to get your grades up. I know a lot of people who have been very stressed out because maybe they didn't perform as well in the earlier years of high school, and now they're realizing that they need to pick up their grades and get a higher GPA. Because I feel like for a lot of people, getting into college, it's more about your score in the SAT, your GPA, your grades, all these different numbers that are supposed to define how smart you are, I guess. I think people are starting to realize now that those things are more important and they're getting stressed out.
Yeah. What are some words, if you were to describe the whole process of like thinking about college, and now we might have to start applying? Well, I don't even know when we start applying. I don't know when we do the visit. That's Becky, why you're here. Give me a couple of words, Caroline, for the process and for the feeling you have about college in general. Just words, first words that come to your mind.
Well, I mean, obviously the first one would be stressful. I'm sure everybody can relate to that. But I think it's also exciting to think about what's coming next after high school. College is obviously a big deal, and a lot of people look forward to it. I would also say that this process is difficult, you know? It's a lot of work, and it's heavy on yourself and on your family.
Do you know where to start? Do you know where we should start? Or who's telling you where to start? Because I clearly am clueless about the process. And by the way, I don't blame you for wanting to go away to college. Because can you imagine living with me, Becky? I'm a lot. Like, I'm pretty sure if that might be the number one reason all my kids go to college, to get away from crazy mom. Do you know where to start, Caroline? Like, who's giving you guidance right now?
I mean, I really don't know where to start.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to focus on like grades. And obviously I'm taking the SAT and all those big tests this year. We have guidance counselors for our school and they're great, but obviously they're trying to focus on the current seniors because they need a lot more help than we do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have advice on where to start.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
Caroline, I think what's funny is there are two mistakes you can make when it's time to start this process. Number one is starting with such a hyper focus on one school. And it does not sound like you're in that boat, but there are so many families out there that I witnessed just so hyper focused on a singular school. It usually has to do with legacy, right? It usually has to do with, you know, what mom and dad has, dreamt for them their entire lives. So that's one mistake. The other mistake are students that wait too long. They're too intimidated by the process. You will be filling out applications your senior fall. Early decision is November 1st. Regular decision is typically around December 1st or January 1st, sometime in there. So it happens fast and furiously. My best advice is to take a middle road in that it's time to become curious. It's time to start thinking broadly about colleges, not getting too hyper-focused. I love that you have good guidance counselors because sadly, so many students out there don't know their guidance counselor, and their guidance counselors are so overwhelmed with other jobs they have to do, right? Like some schools have college counselors that have time and, as part of their portfolio to work one-on-one with students. Some are so overwhelmed. They have 5,000 kids and they don't even know their names. It's just a reflection of the education system in America, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But my little tip, kind of a prescriptive tip for students, is that before you go on all of these college visits, which you will soon, usually they say that junior spring, usually spring break, is when a lot of students will take that time and go visit some colleges with mom and dad. But my tip is right now, if there are schools that you think that you are interested in, whether it's, Vanderbilt, whether it's the University of Southern California, whether it's Bucknell, whatever, I tell students to read their online student newspapers. I'm sure. Have you started getting materials from colleges, like emails? Yeah. Yes. Right.
I've got a big stack of envelopes in my room.
Right. As soon as you sign up for the PSATs, you're going to start getting all of it's the business of college marketing, and you're going to get all this information. It's going to feel overwhelming. And I think what you should do is think about, I'm sure you have a couple schools, don't name them because it's your private decision. But if you're interested in, Bucknell, you go, wow, I'm interested in Bucknell. It sounds a lot like this school. You just kind of start going through. But to save time and money, read the online student newspapers, because I feel like that's where you can get a lot of the more honest information about what's happening on campus in current time, what's important to students. Op-eds can be very helpful. During the summer, those student newspapers aren't as regularly written, but I think during the school year, when I worked at Dartmouth, I didn't tell people to read the student newspaper because a lot of the things that we weren't trying to advertise were being written about in those student newspapers. But I think it's a great opportunity for you from home to kind of feel the dynamic on campus, especially now with politics and everything happening on college campuses. And then from there, start dipping your toe in, certainly by junior spring. And then you'll start making your list. And that's kind of a bigger conversation for senior year. But right now, the average number of schools that students apply to is between 10 and 12, which is a ton of schools. Wow. My other tip I mean, I could talk about this. I'm going to stop talking soon.
Real quick, wait. Yeah. Do you recommend 10 to 12?
My recommendation is if you can identify a school you love, that you apply early if they have an early program, and some schools have early decisions, some schools have early action. Statistically, at most schools, that will be your best shot of getting in. However, that's not the case at every school. So again, ask whatever school. 10 to 12 seems like a lot to me. At the same time, in this day and age, when so many students are applying to so many schools, it's creating this problem, right? You are applying to more schools. Therefore, schools are admitting fewer students. And it's just creating this big bubble. I personally would aim for 6 to 8, but I would try to identify a school early if possible. But again, that deadline's usually by November, which makes your junior year, Caroline, that much more busy.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I have a couple quick questions. When you say legacy, that means somebody in the family went there, right?
Correct. Ask. Okay. Every school defines it differently. Some say grandparents, some don't. Ask the school.
Okay, that's really, I had a question about that. And about the newspapers, are they not censored by anyone, like administration, or like, can you really get an honest take?
No, if they're student newspapers, they're run by student governments. And again, some are better than others.
Right. Okay.
And again, in the summer, they usually lag, but you can look at past issues. And I just find that really helpful because I think you can read a lot of admissions brochures with fancy looking, libraries and beautiful language. You should certainly look at what majors do they have. I mean, you should pay attention to the admissions materials, but after that, go to the student newspapers for a more accurate kind of student experience.
Mm-hmm. One thing I've noticed, Becky, and I've been doing a lot of research, and so much of it is new because, I went to college in the 1900s, as Caroline likes to say. So it's been a long time since
it was more like the 1800s.
Okay. You're not good at math. No, I went to school I graduated in 97 and so much has changed.
You're a baby.
I know. And my siblings all went to community college first. Yeah. I'm the only one in my family that didn't. I went to a 4-year university right away. I will say the way that we approach college as families and communities is very different. I've noticed based on the geography and also the family. So I was born and raised in Michigan. Okay. My husband was born and raised in Indiana. We met in Ohio. We lived in Chicago. We've lived in, so Caroline was born in Chicago and then we lived in New York for 10 years. It's bananas in the Northeast. Like there's so much pressure on these kids to the point where I wanted to write a kid's book about who do you want to be when you grow up, not just what you want to do, because we're putting so much emphasis on it. Yes. I remember Caroline, and she won't remember this, but 5th grade, she was 10 years old. Maybe it was 4th grade. She asked to do a Bike Across America event. And when I asked her, she had very few details. And I said, well, why do you even want to do it? And she said, because it'll look good on my college application.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And she wasn't getting that from me.
Yeah, totally.
She's getting that from the community, from administrators, teachers, the school system. Yeah. It's just, it's too much. And so I do think that there's and now we're in South Carolina, the pressures. Would you say the pressure's a little different here, Caroline?
Way lower.
Yeah.
Okay.
Way lower.
Yeah. Not that the standards are lower.
Right.
But
no, I live in New England. It is bananas up here. But I do, Paula, back to your point, when I think about parents and their roles in this process, you have, the helicopter parent that you hear a lot about. You have the backseat parent who doesn't want to do too much. Sometimes those backseat parents hire outside help because they don't want to be the bad guys, right? And so you have that whole dynamic, which is a whole nother story. I tell parents, I love what you just said, which is you recognize that things have changed, because I think a mistake, I graduated in 2001 and I make the mistake often that I think that the process is, going to be similar to when I went to school, which it is absolutely not. I have a kindergartner right now. By the time she goes to college, who knows what's going to be happening? The appropriate thing to do is to be, a co-pilot. So not the helicopter parent, not a backseat parent, but the co-pilot. Because again, this is a family decision. And I don't think you should be micromanaging your kid. I don't think you should be totally saying, oh, it's good, fine, honey, I'm just not going to look at anything. Because again, this is a conversation that the entire family, you're going to feel the brunt of this. Your daughter is going off to college. You're driving her there. You're dropping her off. You're going to help pay for this. You're the one. No, but really, like it is.
And they're all emotional now.
It's emotional. It's grown and flown, by the way.
I love them.
I love them. And I have a kindergartner and I can cry at the thought of my
Same.
kids leaving. And so this is a family thing, but I do think being a co-pilot and recognizing whether you are a first generation college student, whether you have someone who, is 15th generation Harvard, the process is changing every year. I mean, look at these past couple of years. Some schools were test optional. Now tests are back. I mean, every year the process is changing. Being willing to learn along with your child, being willing to dip your toe in with your child and say to them, hey, let's talk about what does liberal arts mean? I mean, so many people don't know what a liberal arts college is, right? What does it mean to, what is a major? What is a minor? I mean, we take for granted that our kids know what this means. And I think for all of us to just have another learning opportunity and see how these colleges are changing and certainly how the admissions process is changing over time, because it is changing constantly.
Yeah. Caroline, somebody had a question for you. And I think this is also in the light of, there was some recent news. 1 in 3 companies say they no longer list educational requirements on their salary job postings. So it's easier to get a corporate job without a degree now. Caroline, are you feeling, and this was a question from Katie, she says, are students feeling pressure to go to college, pressure to get creative and follow a unique path? And how stressed are kids about this? You already said it was stressful, but are students feeling pressure to go? Or are you noticing that students are realizing there's other options? They could do vocational school or trade school or apprenticeship, or maybe they don't, they're not really sure what they want to do.
Well, I would say at least in our area, expectations are different for people. I know in the Northeast, you wouldn't really drive around and see a bunch of farms. Here, you can drive down the street and you'll see cows and horses on the side of the road because, we live in the South and that's a larger thing down here. It's not a bad thing. It's just the way things are. And I think people are starting to realize that they don't need college to get a good job. People will go to trade schools. We have a lot of opportunities like those around here. For example, we have this thing called Tri-County Technical College, and you can go and just take certain classes and get a 2-year degree or something like that there. And we also have this thing called the Hamilton Career Center. You can go there and get certified in high school to be an EMT or something along those lines. Like one of my friends, she just graduated high school and she has been helping out and she works as an EMT, not fully by herself. She's still in training, but she helps with emergencies like that.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
That's a really good answer. So in hearing that too, Becky, we talk about the first thing is identifying, why or why not college. And it may or may not be the right choice for your kid, but then how do you find the right school? How can I help Caroline find the right school? Not being that helicopter parent. What's my part in the process? Am I the one that's filling out the forms? Because I know some parents that are like, I'm busy filling out all the forms. I'm like, why isn't your kid doing that?
Yeah, totally.
So how can I help her find the right school and help her through this process? Like, what's my role as a parent?
Absolutely. Your role as a parent is to say there are many right schools, because there are. And a fun fact is that the majority of American colleges and universities admit the majority of their applicants. Let me say that again. The majority of American colleges and universities admit the majority of their applicants. So that's just a little take a deep breath, right? But secondly, there is no right school, right? There are many right schools. And I talk about my book. I grew up in New Jersey. I went to public school in New Jersey. Both my parents went to college. And I was sure I was going to Dartmouth. And I checked all the boxes, right? I was sure to do, community service and sports and write the right essay and have the interview. And I did everything correctly. And I was going to Dartmouth. I bought the sweatshirt. I told everybody I was going to Dartmouth. And then I got denied. And I wept at my mailbox because I made the mistake of getting so hyper-focused and feeling like getting into a college was the reward, not the reward of doing all the things that I did, right? You want to do things for authentic purposes rather than trying to check inauthentic boxes. So I didn't get into Dartmouth. Long story short, I went to Colby College in Maine, which I loved. It was such a great place for me. I graduated, I worked a little bit, and I came back to Dartmouth. And long story short, the dean who hired me to, make admissions decisions for the state of New Jersey, I said to him, I said, you denied me, right? You denied me. How can I have this job? And the entire time I worked at Dartmouth, I kept my rejection letter in my desk as a reminder that all of these students, right, had been, the top kid at their school when it came to, rank and SAT scores and doing all these things. And yet still 90% of them were not going to get in, and they were going to be fine because they were going to find their Colbys. They were going to find their, Vassars. They were going to find their place because I would have been fine at many places, and Caroline will be as well. And I think so as a parent, I said earlier, it's great to identify a top choice, but there's no such thing as a safety school. To me, those are dirty words. I hate, because you don't want to marry your safety husband, right? Like, you shouldn't call anything a safety school because there are so many great, there are great options out there. And Caroline is going to be happy at many of them, not all of them, right? So you do have to do a little bit of your homework, but a lot of these schools are so similar in what they offer, are so similar. And that's why they're competing so much to admit you and attract you, is because they're so similar, many of them.
Yeah. How is that possible? So when you get this rejection letter, you've bought the sweatshirt, Becky. This is, you put all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
How can we prevent our children who do choose to go to college? How can we prevent them from putting all of their worth and identity in where they're going to school and whether they get rejected or they get accepted?
Again, I think it comes back to that first point. High school matters for the sake of high school. And you want to be proud of your kid. You're proud of your kid regardless of where they go, right? It does not matter. They are not more or less because they get into X. I can't stand, I watch these morning shows where they have the student who gets into all Ivies and, they're celebrated. And I think to myself, why are we celebrating that kid? First of all, they shouldn't be applying to all the 8 Ivies. The Ivies are very different. Why are we celebrating this? Because there's an equally exciting, compassionate, smart, wise, loving kid out there who didn't get into all 8 Ivies because they're business decisions. And it doesn't mean that kid who got into 8 is more or less than someone who didn't. And so I think there's so little, I think the reason this admissions process feels so out of control is because it is out of your control. These decisions are out of your control. And so let's take back some of that control and say, we're going to care about high school for the sake of high school. And Caroline is going to do things in her school because she wants to act, because she wants to play the flute, because she wants to play soccer, not because she feels like she has to do something that Duke wants her to do. So that way, whether or not Duke takes her, who cares, because she did it for herself rather for another place.
Let's say Caroline gets rejected by one of her top schools. Okay. And you don't necessarily know the circumstance, but you have, considering your background, and you were the admissions director at Dartmouth, the irony of that whole situation, you get rejected and then you actually become the one who's now rejecting students is it's incredible. Yeah. What do you tell her if she gets rejected? How is she not supposed to take that personally? How is any kid out there who's getting a rejection letter from their quote unquote dream school? How are they not supposed to, wither up and feel totally rejected?
Absolutely. And it's hard not to. I did, right? But admissions, I will say it till I'm blue in the face. Admissions is not personal. It's a business. And I think reminding yourself it is, Caroline, you were just saying everyone's worried about the SAT, right? It's on paper, right? This is a paper process. They don't get to meet you. They don't get to spend a week with you. You might get an interview for 30 minutes with an alum. Great, right? I was supposed to read about 150 applications per week. I was moving and grooving. I'd read thousands of applications per week and I could put forward 1 in 10. And I write about in the book, there were some phenomenal kids I met while I traveled the world. And one I remember in particular, she never even applied to Dartmouth. And I remember thinking oh my God, right? But then there were kids I had to admit, frankly, that I wasn't so thrilled about. But it was institutional priorities and it was decisions that we were making as a committee because there were more than one people making this decision. And then there were kids that I absolutely adored meeting who were incredibly talented and they were fabulous on paper. But when it's 1 in 10, there's just not room. And so it is not personal. It is a business. And I think what the name is on your college sweatshirt does not define who the person is wearing it, right? And so it is not your worth at all. And frankly, I feel like, and Paula, you've seen this too, like as we grow and we mature and we go on with life, we see that where you went to college really, it's not, a defining characteristic in who we are as people. It's a moment in time.
Yeah, most people think I went to Michigan because I'm such an avid Michigan Wolverine football fan, and I grew up near the stadium. My whole family went to Michigan.
Yeah,
I kind of consider myself an honorary alum but I went to Cedarville University in Ohio. Right. My dad wouldn't let me go to Michigan because he knew I'd get in too much trouble. And real quick, tangentially, my co-anchor at GMA, Dan Harris, went to Colby.
Yes, he did.
Do you know? Oh my gosh, small world.
I don't know him, but he's one of our notable alumni.
Oh my gosh. Weren't you guys the Mules or something?
We are still the Mules. Don't ask me why. We are the
Interesting.
Mules.
We used to make fun of him. Anyway,
go Mules.
Caroline, go Mules. Caroline, I want to know, what are some of your big questions as you are entering this season? And clearly I don't know about this process and it's been a long time. So I have to treat it as like a whole new process. What are some of your big questions for Becky? And the big questions from your friends I think some of them are going on college visits already this summer.
Yeah, some of my friends are actually starting to visit schools within the next few weeks. I mean, how do I really start? You said to look at the student newspapers. When do I go and visit colleges? Do I have to visit a college if I'm not necessarily interested in it?
Yeah. So there's a book called The Fiske Guide to Colleges, Fiske. And everyone will have, there's so many great books out there, but the Fiske Guide I particularly love. It doesn't cover every college out there, but it's a great way to kind of dip your toe in and start reading about some of these schools. And what will happen there are websites out there that will say, hey, I'm really interested in the University of North Carolina. So tell me some other schools similar to it. Right. And so there are places that will say, if you're interested in this, you might look into this. But I do think, Caroline, right now, and again, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but you probably know, do you want a big place where you have lots of lecture classes, or do you want a smaller place where you get to know your professors, right? Do you want a city school? Do you want a school more in the country? Do you want to stay in driving distance from mom? Right. Yeah. But really,
she won't go to Clemson. It's a great school and it's 20 minutes from our house because it's too close.
But but that is something that right now. I think broadly, right? I can't stand that we ask students to try to think about majors or minors right now because most students change their mind. That's another 100%. Fun fact. They change their mind. And so just broadly, I think if you said, okay, I know that I kind of want liberal arts. I want to be in a medium-sized place and I want to be, someplace an hour from mom, right? That's a starting place, right? If you say, I want to be on the West Coast, I think dip your toe in now. Read for the sake of reading. Don't get too in your head about it, right? Just kind of think about, hey, let me read about what's out there. Because sometimes you'll surprise yourself and you'll go, I had no idea this existed or that existed, or there's the Colorado School of Mines, or there's Colby College in Maine, or, read for the sake of reading. And I also would say, talk to your older friends because they're going through this. They're there already. And I think it can be helpful to just say, hey, you're someone who went to my same high school. You're someone who had kind of similar interests to me. How is it going for you? What schools did you look at? What would you suggest to me? Because I do think, between your guidance counselor and some of those older students, there is a way to just start the conversation. And you're going to have to make decisions for yourself. A college counselor once said, it's like choosing a honeymoon, which I know you're not doing yet, Caroline, not to give your mother,
Please,
yeah,
no.
In your head, whether you want to go on a beach vacation or you want to go to a European city for your honeymoon, right? And then you have to go, well, do I want to go to Florida or do I want to go to Hawaii? You have an idea, and it's just the whittling and educating yourself of what's out there. Don't rush it, but just start reading, start asking questions. We joke in my family that, when it's time for, a basketball tournament, it's interesting to say, wow, I don't know about this school. what is Davidson? Tell me more about Davidson. I'm watching their basketball team. Let me just Google it. And that's a way that we have conversations about what are these colleges out there? Because as your mom said, like, there are so many out there, right? And so just educating yourself broadly. There are college fairs, which are a great way to kind of talk to people, but you will start to whittle them down more quickly than you think you will. So I would kind of enjoy where you are right now. Again, being the present, as you said, I'm stealing your words, Caroline. Be in the present. Enjoy kind of shopping right now and educating yourself. And then start asking yourself some more difficult questions, and that list will come together.
But you said something interesting that most kids are going to switch their major. So in saying that, should we encourage our kids to pick a school because of this major that they're probably going to change? Or like Sherry says, how can we best support and guide the kids who are undecided about what they want to do after high school? Knowing that we might have a kid who's undecided, and also knowing there's a good chance my kid's going to change his major or her major anyway.
Absolutely.
How do we then... That kind of changes the whole equation, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Paula, what was your major?
It was broadcast communications with a minor in music, and I dropped the music right when I got there because I realized I'm good at the clarinet, but I actually don't like it. So I dropped it right away.
But you broadcast communications, I mean, that served you well then, so you knew.
Yes. Well, I kind of knew. I emphasized, behind the scenes production, editing, all of that. But my husband really isn't using, he's in commercial real estate. So he's not really using his major. And I understand that and it forces us to like lock in on something that we may not really love.
Absolutely.
Just because I spent so much on this education.
Absolutely.
Right?
Well, I love the European model, which is most of them take gap years, where after they graduate from high school, they take a year, they work, they volunteer, they make some money, they intern to get a better idea, because we're pushing these kids too early, in my opinion. I mean, I'll be honest.
I love that.
This is when I become an infomercial for liberal arts schools, because the liberal arts, I do think you can kind of dip your toe into, if you say you want to be a history major and then you change your mind your junior year and you become a bio major, and then you decide you're going to graduate and go in commercial real estate, right? The liberal arts kind of wants to educate you in that way. But some kids do know. And that's also surprising to me sometimes, because I've been so wishy-washy my entire life. But some kids will say, I want to be a scientist. I want to go to a STEM school. They know what they want. I also feel like many times their freshman year, students don't know. By sophomore year, again, they get nudged in a direction. Sometimes it's by an internship. Sometimes it's by the classes that they've liked or not at college. And so I would say, don't feel, if you know, you know. And if you don't know, don't force it. I think most colleges, these liberal arts schools have a lot of majors, and that's a podcast conversation for another day. I don't understand why these schools keep adding majors. Where are we going to stop, right? We have 101 majors at our school, but I think they do it because they know that students are changing their minds and they want to be something for everybody once they get you locked into their school. So give yourself some grace. That's what I would say.
Caroline, have you thought about a gap year?
The idea has crossed my mind. I know a lot of people who take gap years don't end up going back to college, at least from what I've read about them.
Okay. Explain maybe what is a gap year? Like in my mind, they're just traveling and living their life before they have to go to college. But you're saying it's an opportunity to work and maybe do something in the field that they're interested in to kind of cross it off the list or decide that that's something they want to pursue. What is a gap year? How does it work? Is it something of privilege? Is it only kids with money can do it? Explain to us because Corrine and Brooke, so many people had questions about gap years, the pros and cons. Tell us a little bit about it.
Gap years are different for different people. And so, for example, you have, the students who it's not a gap year, but they'll go to their PG year because they're an athlete and they want to play another year of hockey at a prep school, and they'll be stronger and bigger by the time they go to college, right? That's not a gap year. That's a PG year. Some gap years, I agree with you 100%, are a position of privilege. And it's wealthy students or wealthy families who can say, hey, Johnny, we're going to go set sail around Greece for a year because mommy and daddy want to do that before you go off to college. And we have time to do it. In Europe, it is a different model. It's not something of privilege. A lot of students take gap years, but it's more of the norm. Here in the US, it's not common. I wish it was more common. I wish it was a year to work, period, end of story. Whether that's a year of working at McDonald's, whether that's a year of, interning with mom at her podcast, I think that would be a great opportunity for kids to kind of figure out what's next. Yeah. And also, after high school, because high school is a ton of work, and some kids apply to colleges before their gap year. Sometimes some kids apply after their gap year. I mean, but it's not that common in the US. I wish it was, but I do think it's a position of privilege here where, it's not common for kids to graduate high school, go work for a year and then apply to college. It's more of a push just to get going and get started.
It's really kind of fascinating. And by the way, Caroline, we won't be asking you to sail around Greece with us for a year. Okay. Although we would love to do that.
Yeah. I wouldn't say no.
I know you wouldn't. Michael and Krista have some questions. Michael says, when do we start applying for scholarships and grants? Krista says she's terrified of the FAFSA, which is FAFSA. It's the free application for federal student aid. It's a form. It's an application for federal student aid. She didn't go to college, so she doesn't really know the process. So when it comes to scholarships and grants and the FAFSA and student aid, when does that process start? And that also has to inform the decision. Because Caroline, what have we told you about college? We have a set amount. We're not paying the full amount. I graduated with a lot of student debt, $50,000 in debt, and paid it off, right? My parents couldn't afford to send me to college and pay for it. And I also paid my way through college too. So I was paying every year. But we've told Caroline she gets a flat amount, and wherever she goes, that's it. Like, she has to take loans on top of that. But if she decides to go in-state and maybe she'll get a great scholarship, then she can still have that amount as a down payment on her future. So I guess that's a weird way of saying, when does this all start? The scholarship, grant, financial aid, and also how much of that should weigh into the decision? Like Caroline, how much that's changed everything for her.
Absolutely. So I'm going to answer the first question first from your listeners. So these forms and the FAFSA form, the infamous FAFSA form.
So hard to say, isn't it?
FAFSA. Yes, it's very hard to say. It's also, these financial aid forms they're supposed to be straightforward, but frankly, different colleges and universities have different policies. Some are need blind, meaning they're going to admit you whether or not you need financial aid. Some are need aware, which means if you need financial aid, it might affect your admissions decision. There are merit scholarships, right, which are based on academic merit. There are athletic scholarships. There are legacy scholarships. I mean, financial aid can be so confusing. And what's important is that different schools have different policies when it comes to scholarships. So it is important to ask specific questions of specific schools. Okay. Now, something like the FAFSA form, which is a more commonly accepted form, the financial aid form. Again, I highly suggest that students talk to financial aid officers at colleges and universities, because I'm not trained in financial aid. At Dartmouth, we were need blind. So I legally had nothing to do with it because I wasn't allowed to know whether or not you needed financial aid. So I couldn't answer questions, et cetera. But colleges and universities have financial aid offices. It is important to start early. It is important to meet deadlines. It's important to be honest. But to your second kind of part of the question, Paula, is that, these are family decisions about financial aid. And I think this is a great opportunity to educate our kids about money. And I know in my family, I didn't know what a loan was. Right. I didn't know what a low interest loan was. I didn't know, what it really meant to be paying off loans for the next 20 years and how much money that was going to, it's a great opportunity to sit down and talk about money. And I tell families, whether you have all the money in the world or whether you have no money, have a conversation about financial aid in general and how you pay off car payments. And all of this kind of comes together. Work study is another big conversation because for some kids, it's easier to get jobs on campus than other places, right? So have conversations about, are you going to be expected to work while you're at college? And I would say when it comes to making decisions about where you're going to go based on money, that is a very individual, personal decision. And some kids will say, I want the scholarship. I want the bigger scholarship. I'm going to go to a state school where they're going to give me more money. And other kids are going to say, I'm going to take out loans till my nose bleed to afford school X.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is a personal decision that really needs to be discussed by the family, but it's a great opportunity to talk about money. I mean, I feel like it's one of the first times that a lot of high school students have these kind of more high-end conversations about how to afford their futures.
Right. And real life conversations, like how to adult.
Life. Right. How to adult.
Caroline, you have Becky's ear. What questions do you have? What burning questions?
So I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Obviously, there's bigger schools that I've been thinking about going to, but looking into these schools more, they can be very, very expensive. And I'm trying to decide now whether I would rather go to maybe a less prestigious school where I can get more scholarships and have less student debt, or go to a bigger, maybe better school, but come out of college with loans and debts I'm going to have to pay off for the next 20 years.
Yeah. I love your question, Caroline. And I think that is a question that's going to perpetuate your adulthood, right? Because we say, should I take the job I love that pays me nothing? Or should I take the job I hate? That, right? It's just a hard question. And I think most importantly, when it's time for you to choose where you go to college, I want you to remember that high school is what you make of high school. College is what you make of it. And so I would see students that, again, and I love Dartmouth. Legal note, I don't represent them anymore. I love Dartmouth. But I would see students come to Dartmouth and think, I've made it, right? I'm going to have the Ivy League degree on my diploma. I don't have to do anything while I'm here, right? And they realize it's really hard. College is hard. And number two, when you graduate, it's still a competitive job market out there. And so how to make the most of the opportunity you have wherever it is, whether it's community college. Yeah. And again, we don't have time to talk about kind of the application specifics, but I began talking about the janitor recommendations. And one of the things I talk about a lot are teacher recommendations, because kids will ask me, who do I ask? What are they looking for in these recommendation letters? When do I ask teachers? And again, I flip it on its head in that you're going to have to ask 2 teachers for recommendation letters when it's time for you to go to college. And I can tell just in talking to you for 40 minutes, Caroline, that you're not the type of kid who's likely kissing up to a teacher just for a college recommendation letter, but you're curious because you're curious, right? That's why you're spending time with mom today on this podcast. Mm-hmm. And so I feel that way about college. Like when you go to college, you're curious because you're curious about the things that you're learning. And when it's time for you to make that decision, you could be like me. I didn't get into Dartmouth. I went to Colby. I loved it. I made the most of it. And I ended up working at Dartmouth, right? Who would have guessed that my path would have gone that way, right?
Crazy. I
had other opportunities with bigger scholarships at other schools that I didn't choose, not because of the money, but for other reasons. And frankly, I had another opportunity at a school that might have been a little bit more well-known. But for me, I wanted a particular thing when it came to athletics that led me to a different school. And so you're going to choose the school that you can make the most out of. And money is a factor in that. Absolutely. But there are going to be so many factors in this that you're going to weigh the pros and cons. It's going to be an easier decision for you once you figure out what you want and how, wherever you go, you're going to make the most of it.
Awesome. Did that answer your question, Caroline?
Yeah, that did. You guys were also talking earlier about like where you get your degree from and where you went to school is starting to matter less and less. I just wanted to follow up on that.
I'm not the statistics person for that question. I mean, there are other experts out there that do real data on this, but I would say that the college admissions process is so competitive. And there are so many ways now of learning, right? This whole online learning thing. Look at what COVID did for us, right? We learned that people can do podcasts from home. They can do the world is changing rapidly. And college degrees, there's a lot of talk about what is the value of a college degree. And I would say from where I sit, the value is in the person who is getting the college degree. And so again, if you're going to go to Dartmouth and make the most of Dartmouth and take advantage of your professors and do the internships and rock that opportunity, when you graduate, are you going to have a better chance of getting a job at your dream job? Probably, because you rocked the opportunities that you had while you had. If you go to Dartmouth and you rest on your laurels and you don't get to know your professors and you graduate and you want to work on the View someday, but you didn't take advantage of the internship like the other kid did, maybe down the street at community college. Yeah. That kid, I mean, I got all my jobs because of internships. I don't know about you, Paula, but it was because of internships, not because of my degree.
Yep. Internships, but like just also being willing to take a $7 job, $7 an hour job, become a PA, took the lowest job on the totem pole and just made the most out of the opportunity.
Yes.
Made the most out of it. So, yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I'm hearing, it's less about where you go to college and more about how you take advantage of what college you go to.
Yes.
Right?
And I would say, I mean, some of these colleges have amazing opportunities. Again, at Colby, back to Dan Harris, there were a lot of communications alumni. No, but there are a lot of communications alumni who went to Colby, and I got an internship at Comedy Central through a Colby alum. And I loved it. And it was this great opportunity because some of these schools have terrific alumni resources. Right. So I'm not poo-pooing the Dartmouths and like they have amazing resources. But again, you got to show up. You got to be willing to take the $7, an hour work. It's a little bit of both. And frankly, I also think it's a little luck because I do believe in a little luck sometimes. Hard work and a little bit of luck.
Yep. Caroline, you're going to fly. I'll vote for you when you run for president.
Me too.
Okay. Actually, I'll be your vice president. Although you probably wouldn't want me on your ticket.
I'll pass. We fight too much.
We would totally fight all the time. Oh, Becky, this has been such a blessing. I feel kind of relieved, and I have like those burning questions have really been answered. And anybody that's curious about Becky, make sure you get a copy of her latest book. Is this your latest book, Valedictorians at the Gate?
Book. Valedictorians at the Gate.
I'm about halfway through it. It's really, really fascinating too. So, and I'm going to remember that story about the janitor for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And tear up every time I think about it.
Yeah. So, well, I just want to thank you, ladies. You're terrific. And Caroline, you're going to be successful wherever you go. But again, high school matters. So high school matters. Next year matters. Learn as much as you can. Do as much as you can.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Becky.
Thank you, Paula.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. Yes, my daughter is a teenager, and yes, I'm an overbearing mother. You probably felt that a little bit in the conversation. But here's the best place to start, and we're going to rewind a little bit. Episode 1 with Ron Lieber said, ask yourself why. Why does your kid want to go to college? Why are you considering this for the family? And he said there's typically 4 reasons. Number 1, for the learning. Number 2, for the kinship or to find their people. Number 3, for the credential. And number 4, just to have a good time, to party in college. And after you figured out the why, then you have to talk about the financial aspect of it. He said this can be a tough conversation, but it's one that has to happen. And great advice, because we just had it in our home. We sat down with Caroline, who has 2 more years before college, and we said, this is what we have put aside. Anything above and beyond that, you have to pay out of your own pocket. You have to get a loan. So having that conversation is key. And then when it comes to what Becky had to say, I just thought it was so helpful on where to start. The advice for our kids to encourage them to look at the college newspaper, which is an unfiltered, uncensored pulse of what's going on at campus. Have them talk to their peers who are a couple years older than them, talk about their experience with the process, what schools stood out to them. Have them visit some college fairs. That's also really great advice. But I thought perhaps the most helpful was ask your kid what kind of experience are they wanting? Do they want to go to a school in the city? Do they want to go to a school in rural area? Do they want to go to a school by the beach? Do they want a great athletic program, right? So have your kid really figure out what kind of experience they want, and that can help you make your list of the schools. And as she said, look, most kids are going to change their major. Unless you really, really, really know what you want to do, don't pick a school based on the major, because the majority of kids will switch their major. And perhaps the most important advice for parents, high school matters. High school, for the sake of high school, matters. We have to take a step back. We have to stop putting so much pressure on them. We've got to chill out a little bit. And high school matters just for the sake of high school. I thought that was so incredibly helpful. Really great advice from Becky. And I have mentioned we're doing a giveaway. The only way to win this giveaway at the end of the series is if you're signed up for my newsletter at Paula Ferris Official. It goes out every 2 weeks, and we're giving away 5 copies of Becky's book, Valedictorians at the Gate. If you're watching on YouTube, I'm holding all of these books up. We're giving away 5 copies of What Time is Noon, the book by Chip Layton, who was on last week. And then 5 copies of The Price You Pay for College by Ron Lieber. So 5, 5, and 5. And then one of you will also win Ron Lieber's Merit Aid Guide, which is an incredible value. Again, you'll only win by signing up for my personal newsletter at paulaferrisofficial.com. All right, we're going to wrap up the series next week with a conversation about who our kids want to be, not just what they want to do, because that's really what matters most, right? So how can we foster the who and not just the what? That's coming up next week as we wrap up this series on college. I'm Paula, and we're going to keep talking about it. I'll see you next week. I know you guys thought you were done with me, but not quite yet. I have one more thing to tell you about. If you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, don't forget to subscribe to the show. I don't want you to miss a single beat or a single conversation. And remember, my DMs are always open. Tell me what you want to talk about.